I hear the front door of my daughter's house through the security glass before I see it, and what I see makes 9 years in a federal prison feel like the easy part. I thought coming home would be the hardest chapter closing. I thought I'd walk into my daughter's arms and finally set down the weight I'd carried through every sleepless night on that steel bunk. Instead, standing in the shadows of her garage at 11 o'clock at night, I understood that my sentence hadn't ended. It had only changed addresses. What I saw through that kitchen window didn't just break my heart. It rewired everything I thought I knew about the people who share my blood, and it confirmed that the ones I trusted most were the same ones who'd locked the cell door behind me. If you've ever poured your whole life into people who turned around and used that love as a weapon, hit like right now and tell me what state you're watching from. Because what I did next, they never saw it coming. Not for 1 second. My name is Walter Higgins. I'm 66 years old, and for the last 9 years, I wasn't a father, a grandfather, or a business owner. I was inmate 88214, and that number was stitched into a uniform that smelled like bleach and regret. Before all that, before the federal marshals walked into my office in handcuffs and shut down everything I'd built, I ran Higgins Freight Solutions, a trucking and logistics company I grew out of one second-hand rig I bought at auction when I was 28 years old. 32 years of 14-hour days. 32 years of missed Little League games and canceled anniversaries. All so my daughter Rachel and my late wife would never once have to worry about money. Rachel had the private school, the horseback riding lessons, the wedding at the vineyard that cost more than my first 3 trucks combined. Then it all came crashing down when a federal jury convicted me of embezzling client funds through a shell account routed through the Cayman Islands. I stood in that courtroom and told anyone who'd listen that I didn't do it, that somebody had built a paper trail with my name stamped all over it. Nobody believed me. Not the jury, not the judge, and worst of all, not my own daughter, who sat 2 rows behind the prosecution and wouldn't meet my eyes. My son-in-law, Craig Doyle, was the one who kept everything together while I sat behind bars. That's what he told the parole board, anyway. That's what he told the newspapers when they ran the story. Craig had married Rachel 11 years earlier, right around the time I made him vice president of operations, a title I gave him because he was smart, hungry, and I loved my daughter enough to trust her judgment in a husband. He visited me twice during those 9 years. Rachel visited 4 times, always crying through the plexiglass, always promising she'd hold everything together until I came home. I held on to those visits like a man holds onto a life raft in open water. I was released 11 days early because of a paperwork correction nobody bothered explaining to me. I didn't use my phone call to tell anyone I was coming. I wanted to walk up that driveway and surprise them. Wanted to feel my daughter's arms around my neck the way I used to imagine it during those long nights, staring at a concrete ceiling. I took a Greyhound bus from the release facility in Ohio, watching the gray highway fade into the rolling hills of western Pennsylvania, into the town where Rachel and Craig had built their life in a colonial house on Maple Crest Drive, a house I'd helped them buy the down payment on, if I'm being honest with myself. I walked the last mile from the bus station because I didn't have cab fare, and I didn't want to call and ruin the surprise. My knees ached with every step, but my chest was doing something it hadn't done in 9 years. It was hoping. When I turned onto Maple Crest and saw the house, lit up gold and warm against the November dark, something in me wanted to run the rest of the way. But something else, some instinct sharpened by 9 years of watching men lie to your face in a cafeteria line, made me stop at the edge of the yard. I don't know why. Maybe it was paranoia baked into me by a decade of betrayal. Maybe it was fate deciding to show me mercy before it showed me the truth. Instead of walking up to that bright red front door, I cut across the side lawn, moving through the shadow of the tall arborvitae hedges Rachel had planted the summer before my trial. I made my way to the back patio, where the kitchen had those big farmhouse windows she'd always wanted, the ones that let you see straight into the heart of the house. I stood there in the cold, my breath fogging in front of my face, and I looked into my daughter's kitchen. Rachel was standing by the island, wearing a cream-colored sweater, her hair down the way she used to wear it when she was in college. She looked happy. She looked settled. But she wasn't alone, and the man standing across from her wasn't Craig. It was my younger brother, Dale. At first I told myself it was innocent, that Dale had stopped by to check on his niece, that this was just family being family. Then Dale reached across the island and took Rachel's hand in both of his, and she didn't pull away. She turned her palm up and laced her fingers through his like it was a habit worn smooth by repetition. He leaned in and kissed her, slow, and she rose onto her toes to meet him the way a woman meets a man she's kissed 1,000 times before. My own daughter. My own brother. I felt something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart, and everything to do with the last shred of certainty I had about who my family was. Before I could process what I was looking at, the sliding door on the far side of the kitchen opened and Craig walked in, home from wherever he'd been, carrying a bottle of wine like a man who'd just come from the store. He didn't freeze. He didn't shout. He set the bottle on the counter, glanced at Dale's hand still resting on Rachel's waist, and gave a small, tired nod, the kind of nod you give when you're confirming something you already knew was happening. Then he opened a drawer, pulled out a corkscrew, and started opening the wine like nothing in that room was wrong at all. I pressed my body flat against the cold brick beside the window, my heart hammering so hard I was sure they'd hear it through the glass. The patio door was cracked an inch for the November air, and their voices drifted out into the yard, clear as a bell in the frozen silence. Craig asked if anyone had heard from the parole office. Dale said he'd made a call that morning, and the answer was that Walter should be released sometime in the next 2 weeks, maybe sooner, if his good behavior credits came through early. Craig let out a short laugh and said that gave them just enough time to finish handling the transition. And Dale said not to worry, that he had it under control, that all they needed to do was stick to what they'd rehearsed. Rachel's voice came next, quieter, tighter. She asked what would happen if her father wanted to see the company's financial statements, if he asked to walk the warehouse floor like he used to every single morning for 3 decades. Dale laughed, a sound with no warmth in it at all. He said her father was a broken old man who'd just spent 9 years learning how to fold laundry on command, that he had no lawyer, no money, and no leverage, and that the second he tried to make trouble, they'd remind him of exactly one thing. A convicted felon 2 months out of federal prison doesn't get to demand anything from anybody. Craig chimed in, saying the plan was simple. They'd greet me at the door with tears and open arms, play the grateful, exhausted family who'd survived the hardest years of their lives, and then, once I was good and settled, hand me the consulting agreement Dale's lawyer had drafted. $4,000 a month, deposited quietly, on the condition that I never asked a single question about the company, never contacted a former client, and never set foot inside Higgins Freight again. They'd tell me it was generous. They'd tell me it was more than a man with my record deserved. I stood there in the freezing dark, rain starting to needle down through the bare branches above me, soaking through the thin state-issued jacket they'd handed me on my way out of that prison gate. Dale hadn't just taken my daughter and corrupted my son-in-law's spine. He'd taken the company I built from a single rusted-out flatbed truck, the company that bore my father's name before it bore mine. Every visit, every letter, every promise, whispered through that visitation glass for 9 straight years had been a performance, carefully staged to keep me compliant while they picked my life apart bone by bone. My first instinct was to storm through that back door and put my fist through my brother's jaw. I wanted to scream at my daughter until my voice gave out. I wanted to flip that farmhouse island and watch the wine bottle shatter across the floor they'd bought with money that used to be mine. But 9 years inside a maximum security facility teaches a man exactly one lesson worth keeping. Rage is a young man's weapon, and it always gets you caught. Patience is what wins wars. I took one long breath of that cold Pennsylvania air, let the shadows of the hedges swallow me whole, and walked back around to the front of the house. They wanted to play games with a broken old man. Fine, I was going to give them exactly the performance they were expecting. I rang the doorbell and heard Craig's footsteps cross the hardwood floor. When the door swung open, his face went white for half a second, a flicker of pure panic before the mask slid back into place. He hadn't expected me tonight. He grabbed me into a hug that smelled like cheap red wine and told me I should have called, that he'd have sent someone to pick me up. I let him pat my back and told him in a voice I hollowed out on purpose that I just needed to see home. Rachel came down the stairs 2 at a time, sobbing before she even reached the bottom step, and threw herself into my arms so hard I nearly stumbled. She smelled like Dale's cologne. I held my daughter and thought about her hand laced through my brother's fingers not 20 minutes earlier, and I stroked her hair and told her everything was going to be fine now. They walked me into that same kitchen. Dale was sitting on a bar stool like he owned the place, which, as it turned out, he basically did. He stood and gave me an awkward, stiff hug, told me he'd missed me, and I told him I was proud to see how he'd grown. I let my eyes drift around that kitchen, over the new marble countertops, the wine fridge, a painting on the wall that probably cost more than my first house. I asked, with my voice trembling just enough, why Dale was here so late. Craig and Dale traded a look, And then Dale sighed like a man carrying the weight of the world and told me the whole rehearsed story, how the government had frozen every account tied to my name, how Rachel and Craig were 2 months from losing the house, how he'd found a legal loophole that let him step in as a silent partner to save the family business from total collapse. He said he did it all for me. He put a hand over his heart when he said it. Rachel grabbed my hand across the counter, her eyes wet with real tears now, though not for the reason she wanted me to believe. She said they'd had no choice, that Dale had saved them from starving. I looked at her manicured nails and the diamond studs in her ears and thought about starving, and I nodded slowly like a man too tired to argue. Then Dale reached into a leather folio and slid a contract across the counter. Higgins Freight Solutions was gone from the letterhead. In its place, in a sleek modern font, it read Doyle Higgins Logistics Group, my name reduced to a hyphen tacked onto somebody else's brand. I picked up that contract with hands still rough and calloused from 9 years of prison labor, and I let my fingers tremble on purpose as I flipped through it. It wasn't a consulting agreement. It was an airtight non-disclosure clause disguised in friendly language, and buried on page 3 was a line that stripped me of any remaining claim to Founder's equity, permanently, in exchange for $4,000 a month and a mandate to relocate at least 200 miles away. I asked, in a small broken voice, why I had to move. Craig said the industry had changed, that having a convicted felon anywhere near company headquarters would spook their biggest client, a regional grocery chain that had just signed a 3-year distribution contract worth real money. He said it was for my own good. He said I should be grateful. I picked up the pen they'd left beside the contract. I held it over the signature line for 10 long seconds, watching Dale hold his breath, watching Rachel's eyes lock onto that pen like a woman praying at an altar. Then I let it slip from my fingers and told them my eyes were too tired from the bus ride, that the kitchen lights were giving me a headache, that I needed to read it fresh in the morning. I folded the contract into my jacket, along with the $4,000 check Dale had already printed, and I told them I'd mail it back signed within the week. Dale's jaw tightened for exactly 1 second before he forced a smile and told me to take all the time I needed. I walked 2 miles that night through freezing rain to the only motel I could find, a single-story place off Route 30 called the Blue Star, where I paid $51 cash for a room that smelled like old cigarettes and mildew. It was the safest place I'd been in 9 years. I locked the deadbolt, sat on the edge of that stiff mattress, and let myself finally feel the full weight of what I'd witnessed. Then I did something I hadn't done since the day the verdict came down. I stopped feeling sorry for myself and I started thinking like a businessman again. The next morning I cashed that $4,000 check at a branch downtown, using the temporary release ID the state had given me, and walked out with crisp $100 bills folded into my coat pocket. I bought a cheap laptop and a prepaid internet hotspot from an electronics store 2 blocks away, paid cash, left no name behind. Back in that motel room, I opened the county property records database and typed in the address of my old house, the one Rachel and Craig lived in now, the one I'd co-signed for. What I found made my blood run cold in a way that 9 winters in a Pennsylvania yard never had. The deed to that house had been quietly transferred into an irrevocable trust in Dale's name 18 months before the federal indictment against me was even filed. 18 months. That wasn't a family stepping in to save what was left. That was a family who knew the storm was coming because they were the ones who'd built it. I searched Doyle Higgins Logistics Group next, and what came up staggered me. Dale hadn't just kept the company afloat. He'd tripled its size, expanded into 2 new states, and just 3 months earlier had landed a distribution contract with a major national grocery chain worth $11 million a year. The press release quoted Dale talking about a proprietary route optimization system he claimed to have spent years developing personally. I read that sentence twice. I had built that exact routing system myself, coded the base logic on nights and weekends the year before my arrest. The same year, it turned out, that Dale had already quietly moved the deed to my house into his own name. I texted Rachel and asked her to meet me for coffee, just the 2 of us, before I signed anything. She agreed, probably thinking it would be one more easy performance. We met at a diner near the old warehouse, and I sat across from my daughter in a booth, wearing the same wrinkled prison release clothes, and apologized to her for everything I'd missed, my voice cracking on purpose over every word. She grew visibly uncomfortable, waved it off, told me the past was the past. I asked her, gently, how she and Craig had managed to keep up mortgage payments during the 2 years my accounts were frozen before the trial even started. Her jaw tightened. She said Dale had set up a trust for her and Craig the year they got married, 11 years ago, long before any of this happened, and that I didn't need to worry about the details. 11 years. My hands went cold around my coffee cup. Dale had been funding my daughter's life for 11 years, quietly, secretly, while I worked 80-hour weeks believing every dollar in that house came from my own sweat. This wasn't a rescue plan built after my arrest. This was a decade-long architecture of theft, built brick by brick while I sat at the head of a table I no longer actually controlled. I told Rachel I'd spilled coffee on the contract and needed a fresh copy, and she stormed out of that diner furious, calling me careless under her breath, telling me not to leave the motel until the courier arrived. I sat alone in that booth and pulled out the burner phone I'd bought the day before, and I dialed a number I hadn't called in 9 years. Frank Delacroix picked up on the third ring. Frank had been my defense attorney at trial, a sharp, cynical man who'd fought like hell against a prosecution case he always said was too clean, too neatly wrapped, to be anything but manufactured. Losing my case had broken something in him. He'd lost his license 2 years later after a messy dispute with the bar, and last I heard he was drinking away his afternoons in a converted garage office on the south side of Pittsburgh. I told him my sentence had ended early, and I needed his help. There was a long silence, and then he gave me an address and told me to come alone. I found him 3 hours later in that garage, surrounded by legal boxes and a space heater that barely worked. I laid out everything I'd found. The property transfer, the 11-year-old trust fund, the stolen routing algorithm. Frank pulled on his reading glasses and went quiet for a long time, cross-referencing dates with a yellow legal pad, and when he finally looked up, his eyes had a spark in them I hadn't seen since the day the jury foreman read my verdict. He told me a theory wasn't enough. We needed hard proof, and the kind of proof we needed, the original financial records and internal communications from the year before my arrest, weren't sitting on any server connected to the internet. Dale, paranoid after the federal raid, had moved all of the company's oldest and most sensitive records onto an isolated system, physically disconnected from the network, locked inside what used to be my own private office on the top floor of the warehouse headquarters I'd built with my own 2 hands. I told Frank I still remembered every inch of that building because I was the one who designed the security layout 15 years earlier when we renovated the offices. I knew the blind spots in the camera coverage. I knew the maintenance schedule of the loading dock crew. I told him to find me a clean identity and a set of coveralls because I was going back to work. 3 days later, thanks to a favor Frank called in from an old client who managed janitorial contracts for half the industrial parks in the county, I became Arthur Kessler, a 66-year-old widower with a spotless background check and a night shift cleaning job. I clocked in at the loading dock of my own building wearing navy coveralls and a plastic name tag, pushing a cleaning cart down hallways. I used to walk in a 3-piece suit. For 6 nights I emptied trash cans and vacuumed carpets, memorizing security patrols, timing the guards' coffee breaks down to the minute, studying the biometric lock Dale had installed on the door of what used to be my corner office. He'd upgraded the digital security but never touched the building's original electrical infrastructure. Infrastructure I'd designed myself. Hidden in a utility closet 15 feet from that office was a manual override panel for the emergency ventilation system, a safety failsafe that, if triggered in the correct sequence, forced a 5-second system reboot across every electronic lock on that floor. On the 7th night, during a driving rainstorm that kept most of the staff home early, I slipped into that utility closet, threw the switches in the exact sequence I remembered, and sprinted down the hallway with a speed I didn't know my 66-year-old legs still had. The light on the biometric scanner flickered green just as I reached the door. I was inside. I sat down at the same desk I'd once owned, now dressed in a stranger's coveralls, and powered up the isolated terminal hidden beneath it. Dale had layered new passwords over an operating system I'd built from scratch, and I typed in a backdoor sequence I'd coded into the original architecture over a decade ago, one only I would ever remember. The firewall folded instantly. I plugged in the encrypted drive Frank had given me, and started pulling every financial record, every internal email, everything, from the 18 months surrounding my indictment. The transfer was at 60% when I heard boots in the hallway, a guard doing an unscheduled sweep. I killed the monitor, dropped to the floor, and folded myself into the tight space beneath that same desk, my heart slamming against my ribs. The beam of a flashlight swept across the carpet, stopping inches from my shoe. I held my breath until my lungs burned. After what felt like an eternity, the guard grunted and moved on. I waited 2 full minutes before I climbed out, checked the screen, saw 100%, and slipped the drive into my pocket. Back in Frank's garage office, we spent the better part of 3 days combing through 11 years of buried correspondence. What we found rewrote everything I thought I understood about my own family. An email from Rachel to Dale, sent 14 months before my arrest, confirmed she'd installed monitoring software on my home computer, capturing every password I typed into my banking portal. Another email, 3 weeks before the FBI raided my office, had Rachel explicitly asking Dale to make sure the prosecutor pushed for the maximum sentence, warning that anything under 8 years would leave me enough time and enough fight left in me to come back and take everything back. My own daughter had asked for more years in a cage for her father. Then Frank found a password-protected folder buried at the bottom of an old shared drive, labeled simply with a date 28 years in the past. Inside was a single scanned document from a private clinic in Pittsburgh, a paternity test. Rachel wasn't the subject. It was for a boy who would have been born the same year as my daughter, to a woman whose name I didn't recognize at first, until I read the address listed beside it and realized it was the house 2 doors down from where Dale had lived as a young man. The alleged father listed was Dale. It took me a long moment to understand what I was looking at, and then it hit me sideways, a second wound layered on top of the first. This wasn't about Rachel. This was proof that Dale had fathered a child with another woman decades ago and quietly paid to keep it buried, using company funds routed through the same shell structure that had eventually been used to frame me. It wasn't the betrayal I expected, but it was the final piece that told me exactly what kind of man my brother had become long before he ever set his sights on my company. A man who'd been hiding, lying, and stealing for the better part of 30 years, and I had been too busy building an empire to notice the rot standing right beside me at every family dinner. I sat in that garage with the weight of 3 decades of blindness pressing down on my chest, and something inside me that used to be soft finally went cold and still. I no longer wanted my company back because I missed it. I wanted it back because it was mine, and I wanted Dale and the daughter who'd asked a judge to bury her own father to understand, in front of everyone who mattered to them, exactly what they'd done. Frank and I built our case for the next week. Buried in the original partnership agreement I'd drafted with my own father 30 years before Dale ever came aboard, was a clause neither Dale nor his lawyers had bothered to notice, because Dale had never officially dissolved the original founding charter when he rebranded the company. It stated plainly that if any partner was convicted of fraud, later proven to have been engineered by another partner, the offending partner forfeited every asset tied to the company, in full, with accumulated interest, transferred immediately to the wronged party. Dale had claimed my stolen routing algorithm as his own personal creation to secure that $11 million grocery contract. That wasn't just corporate theft anymore. That was fraud against a publicly regulated interstate distribution agreement, and it opened a door straight to federal prosecutors. Frank made one call to a former FBI contact who'd quietly doubted the cleanliness of my original case for years. Within 48 hours, we had federal interest and a plan. Dale had scheduled a lavish anniversary gala at the Fairmont Hotel downtown to celebrate the grocery contract and formally announce Rachel's husband, Craig, as the company's new chief operating officer, a public coronation in front of the entire regional business community. I stood in the shadow of the ballroom side entrance that Friday night, watching through the gap in the doors as crystal chandeliers threw light across 300 guests in black tie, as Dale stood at a podium adjusting his cufflinks, as Rachel sat at the head table in a navy gown, diamonds at her throat that I now understood had been purchased with money stolen from a man they'd left to rot in a cell. I wasn't wearing prison release clothes anymore. Frank had insisted on a proper suit, and I stood there in charcoal wool that fit like it remembered who I used to be. Beside me stood Frank, sharp and steady, and behind us, 4 federal agents in dark windbreakers, led by an agent named Ruiz who'd spent 2 years quietly convinced my original conviction didn't sit right. I pushed the ballroom doors open myself. The orchestra cut off mid-note. 300 conversations died at once. I walked straight down the center aisle, the crowd parting the way people part instinctively from something they don't yet understand but already fear. Rachel saw me first. Her champagne flute slipped from her fingers and shattered against the marble floor. Dale, at the podium, went the color of ash and gripped the wood so hard his knuckles turned white. Craig lunged forward, shouting for security, demanding I be removed, still believing in that final moment that he held any power at all. Agent Ruiz stepped in front of him, flashed a badge, and told the security team standing down was strongly advised unless they wanted federal obstruction charges of their own. They backed away instantly. I climbed the stage steps, took the microphone from Dale's shaking hand, and introduced myself to a room full of strangers as the actual founder of the company whose name they'd all been toasting to for the last hour. I told them Dale had asked me to sign a contract, and I'd brought it, exactly as promised. I pulled the manila folder from my jacket and pressed it into his chest, and told the room, loud enough for the microphone to catch every word, that the papers inside weren't a settlement. They were a federal warrant. Agent Ruiz stepped forward and cuffed my brother in front of 300 witnesses, the metallic click of the handcuffs the loudest sound in that stunned, silent room. Rachel screamed and pushed her way up onto the stage, slapping at my chest, calling me cruel, calling me a man who was destroying his own family over ancient history. I let her hit me twice before an agent gently pulled her back. I looked down at my daughter, this woman I had raised on my own shoulders, taught to ride a bike in a church parking lot, walked down an aisle in a dress I'd paid for with money I'd earned honestly, and I told her she didn't lose a family tonight. She lost it the day she decided $4,000 a month, and a quiet exile was a fair price for her father's life. Frank gave the signal, and the screens behind the stage lit up with the emails, her own words asking Dale to push for a heavier sentence, projected 40 feet tall for every person in that room to read. Rachel stopped fighting. She just stood there, staring up at her own handwriting, and something in her face finally broke for real, not performed, not staged, just broken. I turned my attention to my brother, cuffed and trembling beside me, and told him quietly, so only he could hear, that the original partnership charter he never bothered to dissolve was about to cost him everything he'd stolen, the company, the house, every dollar hidden in every offshore account, all of it reverting to me with interest. Effective the moment federal fraud charges were confirmed. I watched 28 years of arrogance drain out of his face in real time. 3 months passed the way federal cases move when the Department of Justice smells a clean win. Dale was convicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and corporate espionage, and sentenced to 17 years in a facility not unlike the one I'd just left. Rachel took an accessory plea, was stripped of every asset under the same partnership clause, and walked out of that courthouse with nothing but a rented apartment and a reputation that would follow her through every job interview for the rest of her life. Craig filed for divorce 2 weeks later and disappeared from the story entirely, which was, honestly, the kindest ending any of them deserved. I went back to that old warehouse on the first cold morning of December, walked the loading dock floor I'd designed 30 years earlier, and stood in the office that used to be mine. I hired a crew to gut every trace of Dale's renovations, tore the imported furniture out to the parking lot, and burned it in a rusted drum out back while the snow came down soft and quiet around me. I renamed the company Higgins and Daughter Freight, not for the daughter I'd lost, but for my granddaughter, Emily, Rachel's own child from her first marriage, a girl of 19 who'd called me every single week I was inside, who'd never once doubted me, and who was now finishing her business degree with a standing offer to run operations the moment she graduated. I sit in that office most evenings now, looking out over a loading dock lit gold under sodium lamps, and I think about the 9 years I spent believing I was alone in the world. I wasn't alone. I was just looking in the wrong direction. My legacy isn't the money or the building or the contract we just renewed with that grocery chain at better terms than Dale ever negotiated. My legacy is a granddaughter who never stopped believing her grandfather was innocent, even when everyone with my own blood in their veins had already decided I was guilty. If somebody you trusted has ever tried to convince you that your patience was weakness, remember this: patience isn't surrender. It's a blade you sharpen quietly, while everyone else assumes you've already been defeated. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button, subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments, who in your life taught you the hard way what real loyalty looks like?